Well, I can't tell you how happy I am to be standing before you once again. I want to welcome all our visitors and, of course, welcome my family. I'll let you know he does lock the doors, but it's only about 2 minutes before I end. So, Grammy, I hope you're ready to run. It is such a joy to be standing before you, and I'm very thankful that I get to do this introduction. And when you do an introduction in something like this, you usually have a couple of things you want to do. The first is you want to lay a foundation for all that is going to come afterward. And the second thing you want to do is you want to make sure we get off on the right foot in going forward. It's one thing to lay the foundation, but it's another thing to make sure that as we go forward, we're going in the right direction. And that's really my goal this morning. Now, I've been assigned the verses 10 through 13. If you ask the other trainees, I stealthily swooped in and took them. But we're going to be focusing on Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 13. If you have not already, please open your Bibles there, and I'd like to read these again. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Now, this passage here, these verses that we just read, are ones of great exhortation. They really get your blood pumping as you're reading this. Paul exhorts you first to have strength in verse 10. Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. And Paul keeps exhorting us to stand or to stand firm. So you read in verse 11, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Verse 13, therefore take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. And as you continue, even verse 14, stand therefore. So Paul is exhorting us to do something. He's pumping us up to do something. But one of the problems I think we have is that we read this, and it fills us with strength, and we want to do something, but we just don't know where to go next. I mean, have you really considered these verses? And have you considered that these things actually protect you? How does truth protect you? How does it guard you? I mean, if you want to go and be guarded by truth right now, what's the first thing you do? What do you do next? And that's where I really want us to approach this, because sometimes we read this and it sounds good. It can be a little abstract, but we don't know where to go with it. We don't know really what comes next. How you're actually strengthened by these things. My goal this morning is to get you to believe that this armor is real. And that it can actually make a difference. That it can change things in your life. That this is just as real as your cell phones. It's just as real as your families. It's just as real as your jobs. It's just as real as love. This can actually behave as armor behaves. It protects you. It guards you. It keeps you safe. It keeps you from being damaged too severely. That's how we're going to understand this, and that's how we're going to go about this, because not only does the armor make a difference, but not having the armor also makes a difference. Just as not having a cell phone makes a difference, or not having a family, or not having love or hope. These things can actually make differences in our lives. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ask the question, where is this armor located? If you want to put it on, if it's actually real and can make a difference, where is it located? we're going to be dealing a lot with verse 12. Verse 12 will help us to kind of pull this to pieces. In verse 12, Paul writes, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So this armor, we would say, is spiritual armor. The problem with saying that is that we don't often know what the word spiritual means anymore. And I don't just mean people in our society, I mean Christians as well. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, and maybe you have as well, that when you read something like this, people will say, well, he just meant that spiritually. Jesus just meant that spiritually. And it's almost as if they're saying he didn't actually mean that. You see, something that is metaphorical or allegorical is not spiritual. Spiritual means something. That's how Christians often misunderstand spiritual. Or maybe you've heard this, and I've dealt with a lot of people who say things like, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And to be fair, that's probably closer than this idea of metaphorical being spiritual. But it's not quite there. The way the majority of the world has understood spiritual and understands today, and the way the Bible teaches it, and I say the majority because the majority of the world lives in India and in China, is that our reality consists of physical things and spiritual things. And so this idea of something that is spiritual is probably better understood as a spiritual dimension. That's how I'm going to put it this morning. That there is what we would call a spiritual dimension. The reason why I like dimension is because it's better than saying the spiritual realm. If you talk about a realm sounds too much like it's separate from you. Whereas a dimension is here. Consider the fourth dimension, for example. The fourth dimension is all around us. In fact, people can mathematically show you how it behaves, what it even looks like. But you can't see it. And that's very similar to how we're going to understand spiritual reality. It is the things that are unseen that influence things that are seen. Love, for example, is spiritual. Where God is love, God is spirit, therefore love is spiritual. You don't see it, but it influences things around us. And this armor is spiritual armor. And the word and this description of armor is how Paul describes it so it can get across to us how it behaves in our lives. The effects it has in our lives. And the reason why I'm saying this is because you have to first believe in spiritual reality in order to believe that this armor can do anything. Because if you don't believe that there's a spiritual reality that influences us and the world around us, if you believe that material things are all that there are, well then Paul just meant this spiritually in that sense. You have to first believe that there is such a thing as spiritual reality in order to believe in the effectiveness of the armor. That it can actually make a difference. And that it can behave as armor is supposed to behave. Now, the way this often works, as I've been saying, is that spiritual things influence physical things, and that is how you usually see it in action. You can't go to the store and buy prepackaged love. You can't make it from scratch in your kitchen. But it's real and it influences our lives. And you can see it in action when it affects physical things. That's really how spiritual things often work. That's how we were designed. That's the reality we live in, really, whether we like it or not. That spiritual things influence physical things, and that's when we start to see it in action. So this armor is real armor. Paul did not just mean this allegorically or metaphorically. he means this can behave as armor is meant to behave. Things like truth, things like righteousness, things like faith. These have an armor quality to them. So we're talking about the location of the armor. We're asking, where is it located? It's located in spiritual reality, the spiritual dimension. That's a big dimension. Where do you go after that? More specifically, it's located in God. This is what Paul says in verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. To tap into this armor is to tap into the qualities of God. As I have for you in your outline, there's a passage in John 4 where Jesus declares that God is spirit. And because God exists, the armor exists. You see, this idea of God and the spiritual dimension in this armor is all wrapped up into, well, does God exist? God exists, but God is spirit. He's unseen, but he influences physical things. And because God exists and spiritual reality exists, then the armor also exists. You've got to start there to lay this foundation. Because if you don't start there, you may not believe that this armor will be effective in the first place. Putting on this armor, then, is tapping into God's strength, God's qualities, and how God can protect us, and what God has to offer us. And I won't get into it because it's not really my verses, but just consider that this is probably why Paul starts talking a lot about prayer in connection with this. So that's the armor. This is where it's located. Now what does it do? The armor, as we've been reading in verse 12, is a defense against the spiritual forces of wickedness. So Paul declares, verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Now you need to understand what Paul is doing and what he's not doing. He's not saying that Christians are to rally behind this call to arms against world political powers. That's what he's not saying. In fact, he prefaces all of this by saying we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. If you're unfamiliar with the language here, flesh and blood in the New Testament really refers to the physical world and created things. Jesus, for example, asked his disciples, who do men say that I am? And when Peter said that he was the Christ, Jesus responded, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Or Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So flesh and blood is an expression referring to physical things, often created things, and not spiritual things. It's really the contrast of spiritual things. So when Paul says this, it is not a declaration for Christians to go up against world political forces. Instead, he says our struggle is against, verse 11, the schemes of the devil. Or in verse 12, our struggle is against these spiritual forces, this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Now don't get too caught up on verse 12 there. This idea of against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. I've read a lot of people go in a direction on this. This is just in contrast to flesh and blood. The heavenly places is another way of saying spiritual reality, or the spiritual dimension. You see this earlier in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3. Paul writes, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. So this expression of against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, he's talking about the location. The location is not in flesh and blood. It is in the heavenly places. spiritual reality. That's what the Christian struggles against. And so the Christian worldview is not one in which world political forces are the largest concepts in this world. That there's something even bigger. There's something greater than that. Now I'll just put this out there and you can pay attention in your own lives whether or not it's true. But I've noticed that there's a tendency for us to treat as our God the things we think are the biggest things in our lives. So if the largest thing I can conceive of is a world political force, I will tend to treat that as my God. I will look for it in order to supply me with the things that only God can supply. Things like comfort, safety, protection. For some people, the largest thing they can conceive of is family. And they tend to treat that almost as if it's their God. And they look for the things they should be looking for God in things like family, comfort, protection, safety, love, identity, that kind of a thing. The Christian worldview is not one in which world political forces are the largest things that can happen. The largest minds at work. That there's something bigger, something greater. And because there is something bigger and something greater, we have to know how to deal with it. And that's what we're talking about this weekend. Is the full armor of God. Verse 12 is not a call to arms against world political forces, but it is a call to arms against the devil. Now, when we talk about the devil, we maybe are a little embarrassed to talk about him. Maybe it's a hard pill to swallow. But I just want to put this out there, that some of the evidence that's used to discuss the existence of God can also be used to discuss the existence of the devil. For example, the evidence of design. We say that there's a God because the universe has design to it. Right? Randomness doesn't produce design. At least not operable design. Have you ever noticed that sin is very designed? And I don't just mean someone planning to do something wicked. But I mean this, that what we call sin, things like lying, murder, adultery, stealing, that kind of a thing, is perfectly designed to break apart relationships. Perfectly designed to do that. And have you ever noticed that in the New Testament, the two greatest commands are to love God with heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself? In fact, from the Christian worldview, the most important thing is your relationships with God and with other people. It would make sense then that if there's a design, there is a mind behind the design, and this mind is opposed to God, and being opposed to God, he is opposed to the two greatest commands, and he's opposed to what life is all about. And so what we call sin is perfectly designed to break apart relationships. I'm going on about this because I'm trying to get you to a place where you see that not only is this armor real, but it is necessary for functioning as a human being on planet Earth. Truth is necessary for functioning, and you can't function without it. Righteousness, as it is understood here, is necessary for function, for being human. And you can't function without it. So in looking at this armor, you have to understand how Paul is approaching it. He's approaching it assuming it's real, and that it can actually make a difference. Because there are real powers at work in the world that actually make a difference. And we have to be prepared and equipped to be able to deal with these real powers. So now we're going to ask the question, when do we use the armor? We use the armor in fighting against the spiritual forces of wickedness. That's what we just read, verses 12, and then also verse 13. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. This is a part of what it means to be a Christian. This is a part of how life is designed. That there are two realities intertwined into one, if you want to think of it that way. The physical reality and the spiritual reality. And the spiritual reality actually changes things, actually affects things. And we have to be prepared to go up against it. And this battle is something that the church is very involved in. In fact, Paul in verse 12 starts by saying, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood," or the New American Standard, "our struggle is not against flesh and blood." This is a we statement. And I don't mean that in terms of size. I mean in terms of like the royal we. This is a we statement, an our statement. This is something we're involved in. Now, I've started with all that, and I've intentionally left out the context of Ephesians up until this point. Because you have to start with that this is speaking in enormous terms. This is speaking in grand terms. There is spiritual reality. There is really a God. There are minds at work in the world around us. You have to start there and to see how big it is before you get into the context. Because you know what the context of Ephesians really is? Is this idea of walking in a manner worthy of the Lord. In fact, you see this idea of walking back in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, where Paul says, "You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air," and he goes on. So that's how people used to walk. That's what their day-to-day lives used to look like. And then he gets over to chapter 4, verse 1. "I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called." You have to start in the grand terms in order to see how applicable this is to just your daily life. And you also have to start in the grand terms in order to see how grand even your daily routine is. How much is going on in your morning to night routine, in your life and the world around you. That there are eternal things at work. There are eternal consequences, good and bad, for just our day-to-day routines. That we have to be prepared for a daily routine that is pleasing to God. See, when we look at the whole armor of God, we almost treat it as if it's icing on the cake. It's almost like it's optional. I'll get to it when I have the time. When the question we should be asking is, can you live a normal daily routine pleasing to God without the armor? Is that even possible? Is it possible to commute to work without being guarded by something like righteousness? And what does a commute without righteousness look like? I think many of us have seen that. See, you have to start in the grand terms in order to see how important it is in the day-to-day stuff, because your day-to-day stuff is important. Your daily routines are eternally significant. There are two ideas I want to leave you with as we wind this down. The first is that putting on the armor of God is not just about us. When we think of the full armor of God, we think of like this is me and God and no one else is involved. But do you really think no one else is involved if you're not guarded by truth? You think that doesn't affect your family or your friends, your spouses, your children, your parents? You think it doesn't affect the church if you're not guarded by righteousness? That's one of the mistakes we make, is we look at this armor and we think it's just about me putting on the armor. If I don't get to it, no harm, no foul. And as I said, one of the schemes of the devil is breaking apart relationships. Therefore, this armor is extremely important just in your relationships. It's not just about us. No one goes into battle alone. The church, in many ways, is counting on us to put on the armor. That's the first thought I want to leave you with. The second I want to leave you with is that there is no other armor. The things that armor provides, safety, protection, comfort, we often look for it in all the wrong places. There is no other armor. We look for it in things like technology. Find a tremendous source of comfort and technology in our world. We look for it in things like our education. We look to that to be the thing that guards us, that protects us as we go throughout life. There is no other armor. And it doesn't mean that you're not putting on armor. You probably are. You can ask yourself, if you're putting on armor, you can really ask yourself, what do I hide behind? And what do I find that will comfort me during the evil days? What will protect me when my days turn to darkness? Whatever it is, that is our armor. And if you're not putting on this armor, there's a good chance your armor may be ineffective. It's not to say you're not putting it on, you're probably just putting on different armor. When you're doing an introduction, you want to lay a foundation. And you want to help people get off on the right foot. And the foundation I want you to understand is that this is real armor. And it can really affect you. And it can really protect you. This is real because it's spiritual armor. And because things that are spiritual are real. Because God is real. And this armor comes from God. As we go forward throughout the rest of this weekend, I'd like you to keep these things in mind. Because if you don't believe that the armor is real, you won't believe that it can actually protect you. You won't see it as effective. You won't see truth as something that can guard you in the evil day. You won't see faith as something that can carry you through against the schemes of these minds who are trying to break apart our relationships. We will face battles. The question is, what armor are we putting on? I thank you for your time.